Hi there. I'm going to ramble a bit about some things I've been thinking about and reading. So this may not be the most cohesive and coherent video I've ever made, but well, I think a lot of my videos are rambles. So this is another one. So great minds, and these are the ones that are influencing me right now. Carl Jung, Nietzsche, Jordan Peterson, Iain McGilchrist. These are front and center of what I'm thinking about lately, along with, of course, number one, Persic. All these people have a profound understanding of the classic static patterns of quality. So they're very well educated, very well read, kind of ridiculously well read and extremely intelligent, but they also, all of them, have an uncanny ability to access the dynamic. Maybe Jung is the master of that. So they have everything stored in there. They have all this stuff to draw from. I mean, it takes a hell of an IQ to do this. But they can also they can generate great patterns out of this. And that's where the creative genius is. So they have mastered both static and dynamic quality. So let's look at the definition of mythos from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The mythos includes not only the Greek myths, but the Old Testament, the Vedic hymns, and the early legends of all cultures, which have contributed to our present world understanding. The mythos over logos argument states that our rationality is shaped by these legends, that our knowledge today is in relation to these legends as a tree is in relation to the little shrub it once was. One can gain great insights into the complex overall structure of the tree by studying the much simpler shape of the shrub. There's no difference in kind or even difference in identity, only difference in size. This is a lot to unpack, and I'm not going to do it completely. I just want to breeze over that a little bit. So in the West, mythos is not just the mythic collective, but it's also, in a way, you could say that the rationality of the Enlightenment ratchets off from that. I guess you could say that rationality is kind of a streamlined version of the big picture of mythos. It's like all the objective stuff with all the mythic, with all the subjective stuff taken out. So the streamlining is efficient, it's reasonable, but it's not always good. So you can't rely on that newer, more rational ratcheting off from the mythos. You need access to the entirety to best understand reality. Of course, a lot of the discussion these days is how we are not accessing the big picture to understand reality. We're just using this rationality. And mythos and logos are both needed. So I guess you could say that mythos and logos together are the user interface of reality itself. So let me just kind of cobble together a working definition of reality. In my definition, it's not an objective world of things already there for us to get born and wake up and discover. It's our lived experience coupled with that mythos that goes all the way back. Obviously, in the metaphysics of quality, you're going to go all the way back to the Big Bang and all that, up. You've got all that evolutionary biological stuff too. So reality can comprise anything that a human can experience, both known and novel, which means you can experience something physical, or you can experience an object that you hold in your hand, or you can experience the impact of the most abstract idea. All these experiences, basic biological emotion, all these experiences are equally real. When you understand something explicitly or implicitly, when you understand, it may not be in language, it may not be in the intellectual realm, it may be embodied. Understanding on whatever level you are understanding feels harmonious. And this harmony is rooted in what Persic would call dynamic quality, the consciousness of quality. coupled with static quality, which is the experience of the almost infinite patterns of our mythos. And you could say, again, that all this understanding is in the metaphysics of quality described by the 4 levels. The inorganic level can only be known in the abstract because we can't experience it, so we have to know it intellectually, let's just say. And even then, our knowing of the inorganic level is subjective in essence because it's based on an intellectual use of the rational knife. It's a model that we have made of the inorganic level, which is just another way to assemble the rotisserie. And that's a reference to Zen, the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, chapter 14. McGilchrist is a really nice parallel to the metaphysics of quality because even though he's talking, his model operates primarily from the biological level. His observations are a lot like Persick's, meaning, of course, that his model is that of the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and it's a neurological model. But his observations are a lot like Persick's. And he is saying we think too rationally, too statically, too left hemisphere, and this is causing a lot of problems, and we need to reintroduce the right hemisphere, connected, relationship-oriented Gestalt thinking. And this model of both hemispheres roughly coincides with what Persick first called spiritual rationality, which is sensing quality first and then implementing it with the tool of rationality after the fact. Not looking for something in your in your static patterns, not always going to your static patterns and your rationality to understand, to use both sides. Jordan Peterson said something about the 2 hemispheres. He said that they are 2 quasi-independent consciousnesses, one of novelty and one of familiarity. Of course, that's really paring it down to bare bones, but there's something in that. So let me play those clips from McGilchrist right now.
It seems to me that at the moment we officially pride ourselves on being a very free-thinking people. I'm going to sound like a terrible fuddy-duddy, but I think the intellectual world was far more open in the 60s and 70s when I grew up than it is today. It's closed down to a number of dogmas. The internet, which is a wonderful thing, hasn't helped because it's possible for people to get trapped in bubbles where they reinforce the things they believe without really hearing other points of view.
So in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a big thing that's happening is we are noticing how dynamic this era that McGilchrist is referring to, the 60s and 70s, was. And I think that when McGilchrist is noticing that, he's saying that we think we're so open-minded and free-thinking because there are so many fractionated bits of information floating around that are unmoored from their origin, whereas the 60s and 70s were truly dynamic because these are reactions to actual collective human experiences in the world, whereas a lot of this information we have now are just bits and bobs floating around that are self-referential and are very far removed from their actual origin. We all have these opinions about these bits of information floating around, and we think we're free thinkers because we have these opinions, basically. What McGilchrist is saying, I think, is that because we are so opinionated, we think we're free thinkers. If you stand back, you look like you can see that we're in these immune systems, these bubbles, meaning we feel like we're free thinking and dynamic because there's so much going on. But we're really dogmatic and rigid, and true free thinking is so rare these days, but you do see it. So watch for people who put, if you're talking about, these bubbles and social media and stuff, look for the people who put their reputations at risk on social media for a greater good, not to stand out, not to be a provocateur, but really because these risks are worth it. There's something greater that they're trying to promote.
I'm a keen proponent that in education, one of the most important things one must do is teach people always to invert everything they believe and see the value in it. In fact, I believe there should be, in government, a department of inverse policy. So whatever the government is proposing, there should be a department that is dedicated to seeing what would happen if we did the precise opposite. And it should be, centrally funded, and I think it would be a very useful exercise. But really, it's an intellectual exercise that we all need to do. If we start being too certain about anything, it means we've missed something else.
So this is such unbelievably good advice, and so is the next clip. McGilchrist, of course, advocates more for the use of the right hemisphere, which roughly translates into thinking more dynamically, intentionally enforcing the opposite viewpoint, and everyone should do this because it opens up dynamism. It's a shake-up. It creates this tension that kind of shifts you out of your static way of seeing things.
This brings us to a very important metaphysical point, which is that a thing and its opposite, according to the left hemisphere, are simply as far apart as they can be, and we move always in a linear way to what we identify as good.
I think we move towards what's good no matter what. I mean, he's saying that in the left hemisphere, you're looking for what you already know is good, and that linear aspect towards the good certainly occurs in the left hemisphere, but this going towards the good, we already know this, is the nature of reality, is the driving force, the driving dynamic force behind reality. So in the left hemisphere, it's going to go for what it already knows, the preconceived notion of what's good. And so if something appears as bad, it's going to be the opposite of what the left hemisphere already knows is good. And the right hemisphere doesn't operate that way. It's attuned to what we don't know, to novelty, and therefore sees the whole presented to us. The right hemisphere detects the entirety. And then, dynamic quality emerges spontaneously, pre-intellectually. And then the left hemisphere can work on that.
Everything I know tells me that in fact opposites are connected, and if you pretend that you are only having one, you don't notice the dark side. And this is terribly true in psychiatry. It's almost a truism to say that a lot of the work one does as a psychiatrist is helping people to see that there is a good side to what it is that they fear and dislike in themselves, but there is also a dark side to the bits that they pride themselves on, and that you cannot get rid of the dark side. You accept it and work with moving it towards something creative. And all creativity and all life is creative. Our mental world is creative. Our daily reality is created partly by us, not out of nowhere, but it's grounded in something else, but we help create it. That process depends on opposition.
It's the right hemisphere that holds the opposites together and holds that tension. So what is truly good, not what we think is already good in our preconceived left brain, but what is truly good can emerge dynamically as quality, and it may be very different from what we thought was good before in our static patterns, in our left brain slots where we've put all our static patterns up to now.
It depends on a degree of resistance, actually. And as soon as you've decided that X, Y, and Z are good, and their opposites are bad, and we must have more and more and more and more of the thing we've decided is good, you end up reaping a whirlwind, because the things you didn't take note of come back and bite you in the bum.
Which is, of course, one of the many downsides of the arrogance of the left hemisphere, that it thinks it's the master when it's really just the emissary, a helper. So you can know what works and what doesn't for the task at hand, but you can't get to know what quality is from that perspective. You only know the quality you already know. You don't have an experience of fresh dynamic quality from that perspective. Now, another useful tool that I have found in understanding and implementing the metaphysics of quality way of understanding of thinking is Carl Jung. So I want to point out a couple of passages from this book, Aion, which is so much fun to read. The first few chapters, by the way, in Iain, if you want to know about the shadow and the anima, animus, and the self, the first 3 chapters lay those out, so you can just get a basic understanding of Jungian psychology. So remember, we were talking about free will and determinism, and that was earlier in Lila, where in the metaphysics of quality, you've got the static patterns, that's deterministic, but the free will is dynamic quality. So the dynamic quality uses the static patterns to create something new and different, and you do that freely, but you are stuck in your mythos and stuck with what's already in your, your collective unconscious, your mythos, your slots, your categorization, your schooling, all that stuff. So you've got all that static pattern that's determined, but what you make of it is free will. So let me read something. This is paragraph. One good thing about Jung is every paragraph is numbered, so it's very easy to find stuff and reference it. All right, so in Jungian psychology, the self is the totality of who we are, and that means conscious and unconscious and collective unconscious. I think that in the models of McGilchrist and the models of the levels, you could also say the self are all the levels as well, so the biological level is going to count. Now I want to read another paragraph from this just because it's fun. The shadow, the syzygy, that's the anima animus, and the self are psychic forces of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them. That means you can't know this unconscious stuff without, you have to experience it, you have to feel it, you have to know it in dreams or in active imagination or the like. And even then you don't always get entirely in touch with them. And that's a long story. You have to read this book. Just as the concepts arose out of an experience of reality, so they can be elucidated only by further experience. Very right brain. You can't do this linguistically. So this is what he's going to say. Philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts, and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of these facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on the duck-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and that it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. So that's a little bit more about those two modes of understanding. There. The syzygy is the anima or animus, depending on what sex you are, and you could go into that too. Modern Jungian theory doesn't pair the male with the anima and the female with the animus like it used to because of the different understanding of gender these days, which I don't think is 100% a bad thing. So I'm not totally politically against that. I'm not politically for it either. So a week or so ago, I watched a Jungian YouTuber, Überboyo, who's really very interesting. And he was relating McGilchrist's right hemisphere to the anima, the soul. And it's a great video. I'll put a link to it. Apparently, Überboyo has a modality based on this where he helps men use their anima to become more vibrant and flexible and stronger men in the world. Maybe something like what Jordan Peterson is doing, although I think his approach is different. But I like this video because it parallels an understanding of the metaphysics of quality, which indicates Überboyo refers to this dual pair of forces, which is the rational, Carl Jung, the rational guy, and his haunting by his anima during his period of psychosis, where he wrote the Red Book, or where he illustrated and wrote the Red Book. And so there's this dual pair of forces, and what Überboyo compares it to is when you're boxing, you box with both your hands. You don't just tie your hands together and box with one hand. You need both, because you need one hand to precisely hit the guy in the nose to distract him, and then the powerful, with this hand, and then the other powerful hand comes in and knocks him out. So this is left hemisphere. This is right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the powerful inspirational force, he says, and the left hemisphere is the practical pattern-making force. So it was watching this video that I got the idea of the user interface, using that term, the user interface. For example, the screen you see on a computer, a user interface, you know what that is. What's really underneath these things that you poke on your phone and you know, click on your computer are a bunch of ones and zeros. So the interface is necessary to use the computer unless you're a computer scientist. And back in the 80s, when these computers first started out, you had to be a computer scientist to use a computer. You had to know coding, but no longer. Now you have a user interface. Psychological models are interfaces. So we also talked earlier about our model of inorganic reality, which we cannot experience. We can only abstract it. And that is an interface, our understanding of atoms and everything. It seems like objective reality, these interfaces, but there's an arbitrariness to them. They seem the best model to us at the time. So there have been psychological models, like Freud has his interface with the id, ego, superego. Jung has his interface with these very complicated one, but pared down is the self, the anima animus, the syzygy, and the shadow. McGilchrist's user interface is this brain model of the two hemispheres, but Überboyo was saying none of these are really as accurate as a more experiential model. The trouble with these models is they're quite less so Jung, of course. So let's take Jung out of this, but some of these models, you know, especially the neuroscientific models and the evolutionary science models and some of these more scientific models are not, they seem very accurate to us, but they're less accurate than something more, let's just say, mythological, because the totality of experience, in this case, what Überboyo is talking about is the experience of the anima, or the muse, or your soul as inspiration, let's say, as dynamic quality, embodies the totality of the experience that interfaces that more objectively describe the underlying model cannot give you this same sense of the actual experience. And we're talking about, again, that harmonic understanding. You can look at a model and you can get that harmonic understanding to some extent, but it's not a full body, total experiential understanding of reality. So better user interface of reality was in fact something like religion. And maybe this is why we're kind of aching again for that kind of understanding as this rational understanding begins to run out, as McGilchrist was talking about earlier. So Pirsig uses this kind of mythological understanding as examples in his book. And McGilchrist, by the way. So McGilchrist veers away from his model frequently because I don't think he wants to be stuck in that interface. He frequently veers away from that and shows us examples. So I would not say that McGilchrist is stuck in this objective, you know, and his model is so complicated you couldn't even say that it was objective. It's a nice combination of both, which I think he's trying for. So Pirsig does the same thing with examples. He does this to the point where the characters of Lila and Phaedrus become archetypal and kind of simplified in a way to be archetypes of the behavior of level-driven behavior. Remember in chapter 15, they're in the intellectual and social realm, and they clash. And so they're very simplistic characters in that chapter, and people object to that because if you're reading it like a novel, they just seem, you know, they seem rather narrow, let's just say. But there's a reason for that, and that's because Pirsig is using these characters as examples to exemplify level-driven behavior, and you'll see they switch up a whole lot when the biological level is triggered, and that's in chapter 16. So you see these archetypes in these characters, and that's a way that Pirsig is using them as an example to help us understand the metaphysics of quality. So I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you next time.
The user interface for reality itself. The user interface for reality itself. So so that you can author your own reality.